Imagine it's the 14th of March, 1974. You're a 38-year-old school teacher living in Birmingham, England. Your name is Gerald. You have worked at the same secondary school for 11 years. You are not rich, but you are not poor either. You have done everything right. You own a small terraced house on the edge of the city. You have a wife named Margaret and 2 children, both under 10. Every month, without fail, you walk into the Midland Bank on the high street. You deposit a portion of your wages into a savings account. You have been doing this for 6 years. The account now holds just over £2,000. It is not a fortune, but it represents something real. It represents 6 years of discipline, of choosing to save instead of spend, of believing that money you put away today will still be money tomorrow. You sleep well at night knowing it is there, the house is warm, the children are fed, the future feels, if not certain, at least manageable. If you have ever wondered why your savings account seems to be going backward even when the balance is going up, stay with me. What you're about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It is repeated across dozens of countries, across more than a century of economic history, always following the same invisible logic, always costing ordinary people the most. And if you find value in this kind of historical clarity, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people never see coming. Now back to Gerald. By the end of 1974, something strange will have happened to his £2,000. He will not have been robbed, the bank will not have collapsed, the number on his statement will actually be slightly higher. The account pays a small amount of interest, but if he goes to buy groceries, or pay for school uniforms, or service his car, he will discover something unsettling. His money buys less, noticeably less. In 1974 alone, inflation in the United Kingdom hit 16%. By 1975, it would peak at over 24%. His £2,000 in the bank was, in real terms, eroding like a sandcastle at high tide, quietly, invisibly, while he slept. This video is about that invisible erosion. It is about why money sitting in a bank account loses purchasing power even when nobody touches it. It is about the mechanism behind this loss, how it has played out across countries and decades. It is about who gets destroyed by it, who walks away relatively unharmed, and what the historical record shows about those who manage to survive it. This is not about conspiracy. This is not about doom. It is about understanding a force that has been operating continuously throughout modern history, a force most people never fully understand until it has already cost them something they cannot get back. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Money is not a fixed thing. This is the single most important idea in this entire video, and it is the one that most people were never taught. Most of us grew up thinking of money the way we think of a measuring tape. If a measuring tape says something is 6 inches long today, it will still say 6 inches long tomorrow. The measurement does not change. We assume money works the same way. $100 today is $100 tomorrow. But this assumption is wrong, and it has always been wrong. Money is not a ruler. Money is more like a ticket to a specific concert. And what that ticket is worth depends entirely on how many other tickets exist, how many people want to attend, and how scarce or plentiful those tickets are. When more tickets are printed, each individual ticket becomes worth a little less. Not because anything about the ticket itself changed, but because its share of the total pool of tickets has shrunk. The face value stays the same, the real value quietly falls. Economists call this purchasing power. That phrase simply means what your money can actually buy in the real world. And purchasing power can fall even when your account balance stays the same or rises slightly if prices are rising faster than the interest your bank pays you. The gap between your interest rate and the inflation rate is the silent leak in the bucket. You keep pouring water in, the bucket keeps emptying, and nobody tells you there's a hole in the bottom. The mechanism works like this. Central banks, which are the government institutions that control how much money exists in an economy, can and do expand the money supply. They do this by various methods, including creating money directly, lowering interest rates to encourage borrowing, or buying government bonds from banks, which pushes more money into the financial system. When more money flows through the economy without a matching increase in the actual goods and services being produced, each unit of money is competing with more other units to buy the same amount of stuff. Prices rise. The official term for this is inflation, which simply means a general rise in prices across the economy over time. And when inflation rises faster than the interest rate your savings account pays you, you're losing ground. Every single day, even while you sleep, even when you do absolutely everything right. This brings us directly to the first major case study in this story. And it begins not in a poor country, not in a failed state, but in one of the most advanced economies in the world. In the years immediately following World War II, the United States government faced a problem. This problem would define economic policy for the next 3 decades. It had accumulated enormous debt fighting the war. By 1946, the national debt, as a percentage of gross domestic product, stood at roughly 119%. In other words, the country owed more than it earned in an entire year. This was unsustainable over the long run, but the politically viable options for addressing it were unappealing. Raising taxes dramatically is never popular. Cutting spending sharply creates its own economic damage. So the government and the Federal Reserve chose a third path, a quieter path. They deliberately kept interest rates low while allowing inflation to run somewhat higher than those rates. This combination has a specific name. It is called financial repression. Financial repression means exactly what it sounds like. The financial returns available to ordinary savers are suppressed, held below the rate of inflation. In real terms, they are slowly losing money while the government simultaneously erodes the real value of its own debts. Think of it this way. If the government owes you $1,000, but engineering the economy so that $1,000 buys only $700 worth of goods, it has effectively paid back less than it borrowed without ever technically defaulting. It has just quietly redefined what $1,000 means. Between 1945 and 1980, the United States used financial repression as a primary tool of economic management. Economists Carmen Reinhart and Emmer Bellinsbrancia studied this period in detail and estimated that financial repression effectively generated a liquidation of government debt. This was equivalent to an average of 3 to 4% of gross domestic product per year during much of this era. In plain language, the government was quietly moving wealth from savers to itself, using inflation and suppressed interest rates as the mechanism. It was legal. It was deliberate. And most people living through it had no name for what was happening to them. Think about what this meant for a factory worker in Ohio who had spent 20 years carefully building his savings account. On paper, his balance grew slightly year over year thanks to interest. But in real terms, adjusted for what that money could actually buy, he was falling behind. He did not understand why. He did not know the term financial repression. He just knew that his savings did not feel like they used to feel, that they stretched less far at the grocery store, at the gas station, at the hardware store. That retirement seemed to keep moving further away. Even though he kept saving faithfully every month, he felt vaguely cheated but could not say by whom or by what. This is the particular cruelty of the mechanism. It operates below the level of ordinary awareness. It does not feel like being robbed. It feels like being confused. And that confusion is, in some ways, part of how it functions. A system that people cannot see clearly is a system they cannot challenge effectively. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. When is the last time your savings account interest rate actually beat inflation in the same year? Not matched it? Not came close? Actually outpaced it enough that you were measurably wealthier in real terms at the end of the year than at the beginning? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. It happened in a country most people associate with vibrant culture, football, and carnival. And it ended with middle-class families lining up outside shuttered banks with nothing to show for decades of careful saving. This leads to the second part of this story. For this, we travel to Argentina in the years surrounding the financial collapse of 2001. Throughout the 1990s, Argentina was held up internationally as a model emerging economy. The government had pegged the Argentine peso directly to the US dollar, meaning 1 peso always equaled $1. This currency peg gave the country something it had desperately lacked for decades: price stability. Inflation, which had ravaged Argentina in the 1980s to the point where annual price increases sometimes exceeded 3,000%, seemed finally to have been tamed. Ordinary Argentines felt genuinely safe. Middle-class families in Buenos Aires opened dollar-denominated accounts. Teachers, doctors, engineers, small business owners deposited their savings with real confidence and real hope. By the end of the 1990s, total deposits in Argentine banks had climbed to over $80 billion. But beneath the surface, the economy was quietly accumulating structural damage. The currency peg was overvalued, meaning Argentine goods and services were too expensive for the rest of the world to buy competitively. Exports fell. Unemployment climbed toward 20%. The government borrowed more and more from international creditors to fill the growing gaps in its budget. The banks were slowly becoming unstable as the government itself became increasingly unstable. The rot was not on the surface. It was deep in the structural beams. And the surface remained calm and reassuring right until the moment it did not. In December 2001, the situation broke open all at once. The government, in an act that became one of the most notorious in the history of financial crises, imposed the corralito. This Spanish word, meaning small fence or playpen, became instantly the most hated word. It was a restriction on bank withdrawals. Ordinary Argentines could withdraw only 250 pesos per week from their own accounts. Their savings, deposited in good faith, were now locked behind a barrier. What followed was one of the largest sovereign debt defaults in modern history. Argentina defaulted on approximately $100 billion in debt. The currency peg was abandoned. The peso was devalued dramatically. Within months, the peso had lost roughly 2/3 of its value against the dollar. Savers watched as their purchasing power collapsed by that same proportion almost overnight. Even those who had held dollar-denominated accounts found that the government had forcibly converted their dollars into pesos at a rate that guaranteed them massive real losses. This conversion was officially called pacification. For ordinary Argentines, the more accurate description was confiscation. Jorge was a 52-year-old architect in Buenos Aires. He had spent 30 years building his savings, not in risky speculative investments, not in complicated financial instruments, in a bank account, because that is what responsible, careful, prudent adults do. By 2002, he discovered that his savings, in terms of what they could actually buy in the real economy, had been reduced to roughly 1/3 of their former value. He had not made a single bad decision. He had done exactly what every financial advisor, every government official, every economics textbook told him to do. He had worked hard. He had spent less than he earned. He had saved the rest. And he had been quietly devastated for it by forces operating far above and far beyond his individual choices. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Because Argentina is not a unique story. It is not even an unusual story. Measured against the full sweep of economic history, it is a chapter in a much older book, one that has been written in different languages, across different centuries. Most people will never know what you now know at this point in the video. Most people will continue to treat their savings account as a safe harbor without ever examining whether the harbor itself is protected. If you're still here, you're not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was built for, the part they never put in the standard textbooks, the part that makes everything else suddenly make sense. The pattern becomes impossible to ignore when you place these stories side by side. The United States using deliberately suppressed interest rates. Argentina locking its citizens out of their own bank accounts while simultaneously destroying the purchasing power of those accounts through forced currency devaluation. These are not random disasters. They are different performances of the same underlying script. And the next example makes this pattern clearer than anything else in the historical record. For this, we go to Germany. Not the Germany of today. Not the prosperous, stability-obsessed Germany that emerged from the wreckage of the 20th century. The Germany of 1923, the Weimar Republic. A country that had been shattered by war, humiliated by the peace, and was now drowning in obligations it had no realistic means of meeting. The context is essential. Germany had lost the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles required Germany to pay reparations, which are compensation payments to the victorious Allied nations, totaling 132 billion gold marks. The number defies easy comprehension. Germany's industrial capacity had been devastated by 4 years of total war. Its most productive territories had been stripped away under the peace terms. Its merchant fleet had been confiscated. Its export markets were closed to it. And now it was required to transfer enormous sums to former enemies while simultaneously trying to rebuild a broken domestic economy. The government had virtually no tax base capable of generating the necessary funds through conventional means. So it did the only thing it felt capable of doing. It printed money. At first, the inflation was uncomfortable but manageable. Prices rose faster than usual. Workers demanded higher wages to keep up. The government printed more money to pay those wages. Prices rose further. By 1921, the situation was already serious and accelerating. By 1922, it was alarming. By mid-1923, the word alarming no longer came close to describing what was happening on the streets. By the second half of that year, the situation had become something that survivors later said was genuinely impossible to communicate to anyone who had not lived it firsthand. In January 1923, $1 US could be exchanged for approximately 4,100 German marks. By the peak of the crisis in November 1923, $1 US was worth 4.2 trillion marks. That number deserves a moment of stillness, 4.2 trillion. In less than 12 months, the currency had lost virtually all of its value. This is hyperinflation, a word that means inflation so extreme and so rapid that money loses its value faster than it can be spent, faster than it can be moved, faster than the human mind can fully process. Workers were paid twice daily during the worst months because the value of their wages fell so sharply between morning and afternoon that it was worth less at the end of the day than when it was handed over. People carried stacks of currency in wheelbarrows and laundry baskets, not because they were wealthy, because a wheelbarrow full of cash was barely sufficient to purchase a single loaf of bread. Shopkeepers changed their prices multiple times per day. Menus in restaurants were printed on chalkboards so they could be erased and rewritten hourly. A woman named Frau Eisenmenger survived this. Her diary from this period has been studied by historians. She wrote with restrained devastation about the experience of watching her entire life savings become effectively worthless within a span of months. She had done nothing reckless. She had lived frugally. She'd saved with the kind of quiet discipline that her generation was taught to treat as moral virtue. And in the end, she could not afford coal. Her careful, responsible, conventional behavior had protected her from nothing. The mechanism was identical to what happened in the United States and what would later happen in Argentina. The government, facing obligations it could not meet through conventional revenue, expanded the money supply beyond what the real economy could support. The money supply grew far faster than actual capacity. Prices rose catastrophically. The savings of ordinary people were obliterated. The difference in Germany in 1923 was solely one of speed and scale. The process that takes decades elsewhere took months here. But the direction was always identical. The mechanism was always the same. And the people who paid the price were always the ones who had done what they were told. And this is where history gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the question is not whether this mechanism exists. Every example in this video proves beyond any serious dispute that it does. The question is what this mechanism means for the people who sit at the bottom of it. The people who are not governments, not central banks, not large financial institutions with armies of economists. The ordinary people, the Gerolds and the Jorges and the Frau Eisenmengers. The teachers and architects and factory workers who were told that saving is virtue, that discipline is rewarded. History answers this question with uncomfortable precision. The people who bear the full weight of monetary erosion are almost never the wealthy. They are almost always the careful. Understanding why reveals something important about how wealth and money actually function beneath the reassuring surface of the official explanations. Think about why the wealthy are insulated. Very wealthy individuals and large institutions do not hold the majority of their assets in savings accounts. They hold real assets, land, businesses, productive enterprises, commodities, physical goods like gold or oil or grain that have intrinsic value independent of any currency, equities, meaning ownership stakes, in companies that produce real goods and services. These assets tend to rise in price when the money supply expands, because more money is chasing the same finite stock of real things. A landlord who owns 10 properties does not lose when inflation rises. In real terms, the value of those properties tends to increase, and so does the rent he charges, because rents are priced in the same inflating currency that everything else is priced in. He is not merely insulated from inflation. In many respects, he benefits from it directly. His debt, if he has any, is being quietly eroded in real terms. His asset values are rising. His rental income is rising. Inflation for him is not an enemy. It is, under the right conditions, almost a friend. But a 62-year-old retired nurse has a fundamentally different experience. She holds a monetary claim, not a real asset. Her account balance is a promise, denominated in the currency of whatever country she lives in, to be able to access that amount of purchasing power. When inflation rises faster than her interest rate, the promise is being quietly broken in small daily increments. Every percentage point of inflation is a direct transfer of her power to someone else. She does not feel it as a single sharp blow. She experiences it as a slow, grinding, barely perceptible squeeze that she can feel in the weekly shop and the annual bills, but cannot quite locate. In Greece, during the debt crisis that began in 2010, this dynamic played out in ways that left permanent marks. The Greek government implemented waves of austerity measures under creditor pressure. Austerity means sharp cuts to public spending combined with significant tax increases. Pensions were cut repeatedly. Some Greek pensioners saw their monthly income reduced by 40% or more. Public sector wages were slashed. Unemployment reached 27% at its peak in 2013, a figure not seen in a developed economy since the Great Depression. And then came the capital controls. In June 2015, the Greek government imposed restrictions on the movement of money. The specific limit was 60 euros per day, not per transaction. Per day. A retired civil servant found himself trapped. He had paid his taxes, made his contributions, and obeyed every rule. He found himself planning his entire financial week around a 60 euro daily ceiling. 60 euros in a developed European country. The people who experienced the crisis with the least permanent damage were those who held real assets. Property owners in areas with demand, small business owners in functional sectors, individuals who had diversified portions of their savings into foreign currency or assets denominated outside the Greek system. Not wealthy speculators, often just ordinary people with simple instincts. They had spread their financial exposure beyond a single account, in a single bank, in a single troubled system. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat somewhere in the world. History has already answered that question definitively. It will. It always has. The only genuine question is whether people will recognize it early enough to matter. If this channel helps, subscribe. The historical record reveals that those who came through these periods with their financial lives intact shared certain identifiable characteristics. These are not predictions or recommendations. They are observations drawn from the documented behavior of survivors. Understanding them as patterns is simply how history becomes useful rather than merely interesting. The first was understanding the difference. The difference between money and wealth. This sounds abstract, but it is practical. Money is the token, the paper, the coin. Wealth is what the token can actually command in the real world. Real goods, real services, real productive capacity. Money is a claim on wealth. But the claim and the thing itself are not the same, and they can diverge dramatically when the system is under stress. People who came through the Weimar hyperinflation were frequently those who had converted their currency into real assets. A baker who owned his oven and storefront continued to produce bread. His real productive capacity did not evaporate. A farmer who owned land and livestock ate while others went hungry. A tradesman who owned his tools and his skills could still offer something the economy needed. They held real things rather than monetary promises. Real things have an inherent durability that monetary promises simply do not. The second characteristic was a practiced skepticism toward official reassurances. This observation makes some people uncomfortable. It is not paranoia. In virtually every documented case, official reassurances continued in confident language until very close to the moment of rupture. Argentine officials were insisting the peso-dollar peg was permanent just weeks before it collapsed. Cypriot officials were guaranteeing the safety of deposits days before they were partially seized. Weimar officials issued stabilization announcements at every stage of the hyperinflationary collapse. The people who acted on observable data, rather than waiting for official permission, fared better. Certainty has a habit of arriving at exactly the same moment as catastrophe. The third characteristic was a form of structural diversification. Most people think of this as spreading money across different accounts. But historical resilience required holding different forms of value storage that were not all subject to the same single point of failure. Some real assets, some foreign currency exposure, holdings that would retain utility even in scenarios of significant systemic stress. The families that came through the Argentine crisis least damaged were often those with assets outside the banking system. They had distributed their exposure across multiple domains rather than concentrating it entirely within a single system that then failed. This brings us back to Gerald in 1974. Gerald did not lose everything. The system did not collapse into hyperinflation. Gerald's account remained accessible, but between 1974 and 1980, UK inflation averaged over 13% per year. The interest rates paid on ordinary savings accounts did not come close to matching that. In real terms, the purchasing power of Gerald's savings had been meaningfully diminished by the end of the decade. He had not been robbed by any individual. He had been subject to a systemic mechanism, adjusting the real value of his savings in ways he could feel at the petrol station, but not see on his statement. By the early 1980s, his neighbors who had purchased properties had found that those assets had kept pace with inflation. Those who had started small businesses came through in better financial shape. They had unknowingly held real things rather than only monetary claims. Gerald's story is not a tragedy, but it contains a lesson expressed in quiet, invisible erosion. Saving is not always building wealth. The difference between them becomes most consequential when the system is under stress. You can be disciplined and patient and still find the mechanism has been quietly working against you. Understanding that mechanism is not a guarantee of anything. There are no guarantees in economics, but clarity is always more useful than confusion. History offers clarity about how money actually works. This has been historical and educational analysis. The events and figures described are drawn from verifiable records. This video is not financial advice. Every person's situation is different. Please consult a qualified financial professional before making significant decisions. This video is not for everyone. Most will scroll past and look at their bank statements with uncomplicated reassurance. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Understanding it might change how they see the world they are already living in. Subscribe for more clarity. See you in the next one.